And so, hello. Just a couple of words before we start the meditation itself. We are familiar with each other a little bit with some people, but some people are probably new. And so, to introduce myself very briefly, my name is Michael Lobsang Tenpa. The strange part of it comes from me having been or being a Buddhist monk for 9.5 years, which I no longer am, just for clarity. But that experience, along with multiple years of serving as a Buddhist translator, taught me a few things about the theme for this course, which is Lojong teachings. So we are going to discuss them. And my role here is to merely serve as a translator slash facilitator. I'm certainly not a teacher in any capacity, not with a capital T, not with a lowercase t. I'm just the worst student in class who's been tasked with making a presentation for everyone. And everyone is probably way more advanced than I am, but the material itself is valuable. So these presentations might also serve some purpose. The idea behind the course was to do sort of an introduction to the genre of Lojong texts. So we're going to start reading Lojong texts from the second class onwards, and also to the Lojong teachings. So Lojong is both a genre and a teaching system, and so we're going to do the practices that come from the teaching system. So as to see whether we personally feel inspired to continue training in these advanced methods for the cultivation of wisdom and compassion. That's kind of their essence. Because we need a firm foundation for these practices, we do need to also make references to the more foundational types of meditation, in particular as taught in the Indo-Tibetan tradition of contemplative practice. And one of those more foundational aspects of practice is a practice for the development of concentration, or the practice of shamatha, as it is known in Sanskrit. So we'll start with a little bit of shamatha today to just revisit sort of this foundational aspect of training, the aspect of training in which we cultivate attentional stability so that then as to use that for the cultivation of the more advanced mental states. So to do this, please find a comfortable stationary position, whatever feels right. And once again, some people would prefer to turn their camera off and kind of retreat into a little bubble of personal space. Some people prefer to meditate with their camera on, sharing their presence openly. That's also very welcome. Whatever feels right in the moment. And with regards to the position, you can meditate in the upright position, sitting with your legs crossed or with your feet flat on the ground. Or you can adopt the Shavasana position. That's also very welcome, as long as you're sure that you're not actively falling asleep. And as we adopt the chosen stationary position, whether that's upright or supine, the first thing to do is to notice the contact between our body and the ground that's holding us. Noticing the sensations in the parts of the body that are now connected to the ground. Feeling the firmness, the stability, the groundedness down there. And allowing the body to respond in the spirit of relaxation, releasing the physical tension and experiencing this relaxation response in our feet and toes and our legs in general first. And then our pelvic floor, the area around our hips, our lower abdomen and lower back. Then our chest, shoulders, upper arms, forearms, hands, fingers. Fully releasing all the types of tension and all the types of deliberate movement. Enjoying the stillness while being aware of the sensations. Then exploring the sensations in our neck and throat, the back of our head, our crown, and our facial muscles. Then, for a little while, directing our awareness towards the sensations associated with the process of breathing throughout the entire body. All the sensations that change when we breathe in and when we breathe out. Using these as an anchor for our awareness and just observing with curiosity and openness moment by moment. Strengthening the qualities of relaxation, stability, and clarity, therefore. Whenever our attention strays away or moves away to other objects, including our thoughts and stories, noticing that and gently bringing it back to the process of breathing and the associated sensations in particular. If something needs to be released, tension or distracting thoughts, releasing that with the exhalation. And then with the inhalation, coming back to the sensations that we're observing. And then, having trained in shamatha in this manner for a little while, just to prepare our mind, spending some moments generating a truly vast and positive motivation for the main part of our class by thinking of our highest vision for what is spiritually or psychologically possible for us personally. What kind of being do we want to become by working with our mind, and how would we want to affect the lives of others in terms of bringing them happiness and helping them liberate themselves from suffering? A good example of a traditional motivation that's used in this system of practices in the Lojong teachings is an aspiration for the full uncovering of our amazing potential so that we can serve as a cooperative condition for the happiness and freedom of all beings. And the way to work with such an aspiration is to identify it, focus on it, and then breathe life into it by wishing, may everything that I'm about to do contribute to the realization of this goal for the benefit of all beings. Every moment of listening, contemplation, and meditation, may they all contribute to the realization of this goal. Resting with this for a few moments, breathing life into it if we wish. And then coming back to our body, just to ground ourselves there and to notice the sensations once again. Then, introducing a tiny bit of movement to the body, maybe by rocking back and forth or moving our fingers, reactivating our facial muscles, stretching if we feel like stretching. Eventually, bringing the meditation to a close and gently returning to first the physical space around us and then to the virtual space that we're using together right now. Thank you. So, This is our preliminary meditation, quite obviously, and it goes straight into the heart of the system of practices that we're about to discuss. The whole point of Lojong methods is to help us cultivate exceptional levels of wisdom and compassion, in particular as they relate to this very special mental state known as bodhicitta in the Buddhist tradition, or the wish, kind of the aspiration for full awakening, and then the wisdom that underpins that awakening. And because a large chunk of Lojong teachings is just about training in this powerful aspiration before we are able to combine that with wisdom, Lojong teachings put great emphasis on the more elaborate forms of the very meditation that we did just now, the latter part of it. Before that, we trained a little bit in mindfulness of breathing, which is a very standard concentration technique used extremely widely in the Buddhist tradition, but beyond that, all across the world and multiple lineages, and these days also in the secular modalities for teaching mindfulness. That part was purely technical. It's just to help us find some mental space or establish some mental space that we would then be able to use for the more complex types of mental cultivation. And as we go through the course, we will talk about a couple other concentration techniques that once again would serve purely as a building block for everything else, while the main emphasis will be on the qualities of wisdom and compassion and the different ways to cultivate those. So, just in terms of the format of this course, our class today is more of an introduction to the history of Lojong, the logic of Lojong, the basic content of Lojong teachings, and then starting from the second class onwards, we will be reading actual Lojong texts and trying to make sense of them. Once again, as a preliminary note, I'm not a teacher, barely even a translator, wouldn't even call myself a real practitioner or anything like that. And the Lojong teachings are extremely advanced. So the idea here is sort of to do a collective reading where, as a translator, I'm barely, but still a little bit, able to provide some historical notes, linguistic notes, and so forth, and certain material from the traditional commentaries and oral commentaries as well that help us put the material into practice. And a good spirit to sort of maintain mentally when going into all of this is that of, let's say, an expedition or just checking something out. You know, we are looking at these practices which have been used for centuries in the Indo-Tibetan tradition. And even though we know that Tibetans have received immense benefit from this, we're not assuming necessarily that these practices are perfect for us. We're checking them out. We're seeing if something makes sense. We're seeing if there's something that causes doubt or confusion, then we can ask questions and work with those doubts. And we're seeing whether there's anything practical for us personally, something that could affect my life positively, make my mind more refined. If there is something like that, we can take it up and play with it for as long as we want to, if we wish, all the way up until full enlightenment. And if something doesn't work, well, no problem. We just put it to the side. And as one of my teachers once said, when we just eat fruit. You know, one time he was asked, well, what about this? What about that? Doesn't work for me. It doesn't, and this doesn't work for me, and that wouldn't work. He said, well, don't worry, just eat fruit. You know, so if nothing, if in this course makes any sense to you and nothing feels inspiring, totally fine. There are many other systems of practice that might work for us personally. But the one we're about to discuss here is known as Lojong. So let me just open my slides to see whether we can talk a little bit about this whole system. In the Tibetan cultural tradition, typically when one is introducing a teaching, one is supposed to talk about the history and the lineage of that teaching. And one also needs to talk about one's own relationship to that lineage a little bit as well to make sure that there's sort of a seal of authenticity to it all. So, with regards to my own relationship to it all, once again, for whatever karmic reason, I ended up being a Buddhist translator and interpreter, and I'm still doing translation and interpretation work a lot with my Buddhist teachers. And I've had the great joy and privilege of accompanying Buddhist masters, both of Himalayan and non-Himalayan origin. And in particular, I've had the great joy of translating a little bit for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his books, and also his oral teachings, and for many, many other teachers, some of whom I will be mentioning quite a lot in the upcoming classes. So there's a full list on my website if anyone's interested, but suffice it to say, I've had a lot of interactions with the Indo-Tibetan lineage and have been sort of the recipient of incredible kindness from Tibetans in particular, but also from members of other Himalayan communities who have shared some of the most incredible teachings with me, and also back in the day gave me monastic ordination and allowed me to provide some service as a translator and as an interpreter and so forth. A large chunk of those interactions had something to do with the Lojong teachings. So there was always a lot of Lojong in the oral teachings that I had the joy of interpreting for in the books that I translated. So all of this established a certain connection to the Lojong genre for me, and it is the genre that I find to be the most inspiring and helpful in terms of my own very humble attempts to slowly, slowly become a better person. So even though this project is still in its early stages, Lobsang Tenpa being a decent human being, the initial steps have been somewhat helpful or successful precisely because the Lojong teachings are great and the teachers that were explaining them to me really had a powerful personal familiarity with this material. So throughout the course, I will be also mentioning the books that I recommend, some of which have been written by modern day masters. And I will also be making references to certain videos that you can watch after the course or throughout the course. And then at the end, I will even recommend an online program that takes you on a multi-year Lojong journey, if that's something that you would like to explore, where you are given a morning meditation about 35, 40 minutes and an evening meditation about 35, 40 minutes. And a lot of it is centered on Lojong. And that is a program that includes multiple years of practice. So for those who want to dive into Lojong full on, even that is a possibility. So there's lots of stuff that we can explore. And all of that is to say that this is not something that Lobsang Tenpa is making up. All of these things you will see in direct connection to the traditional material. So that's with regards to my personal connection to it and sort of the authenticity of that. But then with regards to the teachings themselves, we will talk about the history of Lojong today and its foundational principles precisely to make sure that this seems valid, at least in terms of its history. Whether it seems valid for us personally, whether it feels helpful for us personally, that's another issue. That's something that we will explore throughout these classes. But right now, we need to make sure that these teachings have not been once again invented by me or Kat or Phil, or any of us, so as to trick you into something that you might not want to be doing. No, this is a thing that has history to it. And to this day, Lojong teachings are practiced extremely widely in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, and now they're finding, or sort of their derivatives are finding their way to even secular, psychological, and therapeutic modalities. Why? Precisely because these teachings are powerful, so even elements of them, when taken sort of into a more modern psychology-related context, still retain a certain transformative power. They might not be as powerful as when they're still in their original context, the full system, but even when transferred somewhere else, still they have certain efficiency that can actually be tested and explored through scientific means. So very fascinating stuff in that regard, the transformations that we're observing with the elements of these teachings. We will, however, be looking at the full sized version of it. So The first part, as I mentioned, is a general introduction. And this is where, for those who are perhaps slightly less familiar with the overall logic of Buddhism, this is where it's helpful to revisit some of the foundational ideas related to the Buddhist working model, or the Buddhist working hypothesis for working with the mind. Why? Because Lojong teachings are Buddhist teachings originally. We can use elements of Lojong even if we identify with a different tradition, or if we don't identify with any tradition whatsoever. But it is important to explain why Lojong teachings view reality or invite us to view reality in a specific manner. And for that, it's important to revisit some of the foundational ideas of Buddhism in general. So it's good to start with sort of a historical narrative, perhaps, but we can keep it relatively brief. So many people would know that there was a person that we now refer to as the Buddha, living approximately 2,500 years ago. And many people would be familiar with some of the general facts from the Buddha's slightly mythologized biography, maybe because you've read something about it, but also maybe because you've seen Little Buddha by Bertolucci or movies of a similar nature. And the basic narrative related to the Buddha's life is that he was born as a prince in northern India. And India back then was a large conglomeration of small states, or proto-states, as we sometimes call. These were not states in the modern sense of the word. They were much more flexible, and there were lots of stuff. There was lots of stuff happening at all times politically, and it was kind of a very large region that, specifically 2005 years ago, was going through a major spiritual turmoil, or we could also say spiritual transformation. There were, as it's sometimes said, more than 100 philosophical schools, or teachers that had very different ideas about the nature of reality. And the society viewed those teachers and the very quest for the nature of reality very favorably, in that if you became a wandering ascetic or a wandering yogi, you would receive the food that you need to survive. So you were supported physically, just in terms of having food and maybe some scraps for clothing. And the kind of the investment idea was that if we feed these people, one of them might actually figure out a recipe for the eradication of suffering and for the cultivation of happiness. So lay people, including kings and queens, were happily providing meals for these wandering ascetics, knowing extremely well that some of those ascetics had very wild and convoluted ideas. There were some ascetics who believed that different types of physical suffering, including self-inflicted torture, would perhaps eradicate suffering. Some of those ascetics, or some of those spiritual practitioners, let's say, were very closely aligned with the traditional Brahmanic teachings of the time, thinking that, yes, indeed, making these elaborate fire offerings, following the Vedas closely, relying on the transmitted knowledge of our ancestors, that's something that can bring about spiritual enlightenment or spiritual transformation and bring happiness. And there were many, many different flavors of it all. Out of this era arose another very important tradition that's still present today, Jainism. Um, but the one we're focused on now is Buddhism. So in that climate, Buddha was born as a prince, and early on, different sources actually describe this in slightly different ways. Early on, the Buddha, the future Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, became very interested in the nature of suffering and the ways to eradicate suffering. And as the story goes, eventually, when that wish became extremely strong, he left the royal palace, which he was confined to by his royal father. He left the palace, he left temporarily behind his wife and his newborn son, even though later on in life he was reunited with them, and they become members of his spiritual community. And he went on to become a self-ordained monastic looking for enlightenment. So he experimented with practices of profound concentration. He experimented with different ascetic methods. None of that brought about an irreversible eradication of suffering. And then eventually he found a unique combination of methods or principles that it seemed, and that was the result of his kind of the result of his experimentation, that seemed capable of eradicating some of the afflictive factors from our mind, some of the polluting factors from our mind. He in particular discovered that if you combine profound concentration, which had been by then known to Indians for maybe a couple thousand years at least. If you combine that, very, very profound states of concentration, well beyond what modern psychology considers to be realistically possible. If you combine that with an inquiry into the nature of reality, into the nature of the self, into the nature of the mind, if you combine contemplative technology and contemplative science, you could call them this way, that's how Dr. Alan Wallace refers to them, you can irrevocably, irreversibly transform the mind so that the mind starts to experience a very profound and stable type of inner bliss that is free from all of the types of suffering that we typically experience, all the kind of daily pain of existing in the way that we exist. All of that can be removed. Happiness or bliss can be brought about in a very, very stable and profound manner. So that was his major discovery. And when he reached that experientially, he became the Buddha, which literally means the awakened one. So he woke up to this true potential of the mind, and he woke up to the true nature of our lived experience, which is not as solid, real, and fixed as it seems to us right now. And so that was the Buddha's major discovery, and he spent the next 50 years or so teaching the methods that he arrived at, a great variety of different methods because they're great. There's a great number of different concentration techniques that you can practice. There's a great variety of inquiry or insight techniques that you can practice. And on top of that, you also have the practices that support the process. For example, you need a firm foundation of ethical intelligence for your meditations to be successful. So Buddha taught a lot on that. You need actually to succeed in your journey or in this exploration, you need extreme levels of kindness and openness of the heart. So Buddha taught a lot of methods for that. And kind of as a result of his extremely elaborate teaching career, we then have these lineages coming from the Buddha in which these practices were transmitted generation by generation. So initially, those were transmitted orally. Eventually, they were written down primarily in Pali and Sanskrit. Pali was a spoken language back then. Sanskrit was a classical traditional language, somewhat akin to Latin. But eventually, these two languages primarily, even though there are some others, were used to record some of those teachings that initially were transmitted orally. And then when those teachings were put to writing, by then, some of the earliest Buddhist universities appeared in India. So these are actually the first universities in our planet. Sometimes some of the British ones claim that title, some of the Spanish ones on occasion, because Spain was back then, and a part of the Muslim civilization. But it seems that the actual earliest universities were the universities of ancient India, and we often mention two extremely illustrious ones, Nalanda and Vikramashila. There were more. There was a third one, Adantapuri, and another one. The earliest one is Takshashila or Taxila. But Nalanda and Vikramashila played a large role in furthering the development of Buddhist psychology and Buddhist contemplative practice. They did not challenge any of the original discoveries of the Buddha, but they were trying to figure out how to best explain these discoveries and how to apply them in practice. And the Lojong teachings that we're discussing here, they do go in a way all the way back to the Buddha because the foundational principles were described by the Buddha. And they do also go all the way back to these two universities, Nalanda and Vikramasila, and to the scholars and practitioners of those universities. They were all scholars practitioners in that they were not simply building theories about the mind and how to transform it. They were also all practicing meditation, including advanced forms of tantric meditation. And so, on the basis of their intellectual work and also their practice, such teachings as Lojong arose. So the foundations of Lojong were established in Nalanda and Vikramasila, even though the genre called Lojong only appeared a bit later in Tibet when one of the masters of Nalanda came to Tibet to help out with the clarification and the spread of Buddhism there. But going all the way back to the Buddha's foundational working hypothesis, the Buddha was extremely concerned with this concept or problem of suffering, but he was also extremely concerned with the problem of happiness. So we could first identify these two as they are identified in Buddhism. That's quite helpful. So happiness in general, and you could also translate this Sanskrit term sukha in other ways, calling it comfort or bliss, well-being, and probably there's a lot of other synonyms of that nature. But happiness is the most commonly used translation for this. This term happiness, or sukha in Sanskrit and Pali, is defined as any state that we want to extend when it is experienced or to trigger when it's not there. So anything that we want to continue experiencing or that we want to evoke even though it's not there, that's happiness. And there are many, many, many different flavors of this happiness, many, many different types of this. So the bliss of having a nice cup of tea, that's sukha. That's a type of sukha. But so is the irreversible and completely stable bliss of enlightenment. And so you have this huge spectrum of different types of happiness, all the way down, all the way from extremely simple ones and transitory ones, and all the way up to extremely stable and profound ones. Now, the reason to discuss this is because Lojong teachings talk extremely elaborately about the recipes for finding happiness and removing suffering. But unless and until we know what happiness is conceptually here, we might be confused when trying to read actual Lojong texts, which is something that we're going to start doing next week. So this is happiness, and once again, it is subdivided into many different flavors and types, some of which are completely unreliable, and some of which are ultimately reliable in terms of their nature. And perhaps as an additional note, just to look at it might be helpful to also look at the term sukha itself. Etymologically, there are slightly different explanations offered by different scholars of Sanskrit. In particular in the Buddhist tradition, but beyond that, the term sukha is universal. It's used by all the dharmic traditions of India, so not just Buddhism, but also Hinduism with its multiple branches, and then Jainism and Sikhism. These four great dharmic traditions of India all use this term. So etymologically, it's divided into two parts, su and ka. Su can mean good or well. It's a very common prefix that's a part of many words, and usually denotes goodness or something being good, being wholesome, being positive, contributing to happiness once again, or to well-being. And ka, in this case, as explained by some Sanskritologists, can refer to space. So sukha then becomes good space, a space basically of existence in which everything flows harmoniously and nicely and without unnecessary tension and friction and all sorts of difficulties. So when your day feels good, when everything is happening as it's supposed to happen according to your view of reality, when your morning cup of coffee tastes good, and then people are smiling at you, and then your job, you're capable of doing your job extremely well, and then you're seeing your friends at night, and then your evening cup of calming tea is good. That's a kind of an example, a very simplistic example of sukha. Your day served as this good space where everything externally was flowing nicely. But as we explore this idea of genuine happiness on a deeper level, we can perhaps consider that the more important type of good space to create is the internal one, the one in our mind, because external conditions, as long as we are on this planet at least, will sometimes be challenging. But if we're able to create this wholesome, truly wholesome, joyful space within, then no external circumstances would be able to prevent us from staying happy. So that's kind of the emphasis of Lojong teachings, actually, to go from an externally oriented model of sukha to the internally oriented model of sukha. And the very term for a Buddhist in Tibetan, Nangpa, literally means an internal being or someone who is oriented towards the internal. Nang means inside, and pa is just suffix that turns it into a noun. So an internalist. But an internalist in what regard? An internalist in that we are someone, if we are a real capital B Buddhist, we are someone who is primarily looking for happiness on the inside, within this inside space, not at the exclusion of outer reality, not refusing to work with outer reality when necessary or bring about social change, for example, but knowing that it all primarily boils down to our mental states. And it is the crystallization of these mental states that then manifests as, for example, social institutions, some of which can be extremely wholesome and some of which can be extremely harmful. So putting the primary emphasis, the main emphasis on this internal stuff with regards to sukha and with regards to its opposite, dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, sometimes as discomfort, pain, and probably other versions, other options as well. But sometimes in especially the more modern Buddhist translations, you would just see the term dukkha itself left untranslated. Why? Because when we say suffering, we sort of gravitate towards the more obvious types of discomfort or displeasure. We kind of imagine someone, with who's actively crying or actively in pain. There's something very wrong with our body. There's something very wrong with our heart or their mind. They've been dumped, perhaps, or they lost their job. That's suffering within. But dukkha actually refers to a much broader spectrum of unpleasant experiences. And the definition is that dukkha or suffering is a state that we want to remove when it's present and avoid when it's not present. So anything that falls under this definition is dukkha or suffering, the thing that Buddha wanted to find the recipe for. So that includes a minor headache or a moment of discomfort that we experience when something's not going the way we want it to go. And then all the way up to the most profound, excruciating types of pain that in our world manifest, let's say, in the war zones or when people have horrible, horrible diseases that eat and consume their bodies and so forth. All of that is dukkha, this entire spectrum from a minor moment of displeasure to the most profound pain. And etymologically, again, it's the same ka, that means space, but accompanied by a different prefix, du, bad. So it's bad space. It's space in which there is friction, in which the energies of reality are not flowing freely, not flowing nicely. It's a day that's kind of not going well and making us really uncomfortable. It's an awkward conversation that's so clunky and so unnatural that that we're just suffering throughout the whole thing. And so good space and bad space. Sukha is good space, dukkha is bad space. Another etymological explanation for them is that ka, this root that refers to space, is not just space in general. It's specifically the space in the center of a will. So the hole in the center of a will. That's a very Buddhist etymological explanation. Whereas talking about space in general is a thing that's common to all the four Dharmic traditions. But when we focus on this hole in the center of a will, and we say that's what ka is referring to, sukha means that that hole in the center of a will is made well, competently. And so the will is turning as it should. And so there's that natural harmonious flow to our experiences. And there's no friction, once again, no problem. The kind of the will of our life is turning nicely and bringing us all sorts of joy. When that whole is made incompetently, where there's something wrong with it, then the will would be not turning at all, or it would be turning in a very, very problematic, difficult, convoluted manner. And that's kind of what an existence filled with dukkha is like. So on any given day, of course, we have different combinations of sukha and dukkha. Some days feel like there's more sukha and just a tiny bit of dukkha, just enough to not forget that we are in samsara, as Buddhists would say. And on some days, it's mostly dukkha. And for some beings, obviously, if we watch the news or kind of even remotely know of what's happening on the planet, for some beings, it's just mostly dukkha with a few sprinkles of sukha here and there, but not enough to make it feel like it's even worth existing. You know, it's just a lot of dukkha, a lot of pain, so much pain. So we do have these two states alternating or manifesting in our experience at all times. And so the Buddha's discovery was that through cultivating sukha in the depths of our being, we can gradually remove not just the inner dukkha, the opposite of sukha, not just the inner suffering, let's say stemming from stress and anxiety and worry and compulsive ideation and all those sorts of things. But we can eventually completely transform the mode of our existence so as to not experience any dukkha whatsoever at all, ever again. That was the Buddha's big discovery. And for us, it's his big working hypothesis. When I have to believe him, he said that it's possible, and he explained how to replicate his experiment. But to replicate his experiment, we would need to spend a lot of time. If we're extremely focused and concentrated, it would be quite a few years in retreat in this life. If we are kind of leisurely about it, it would be lots of lifetimes. And of course, Buddhists do, as a given, accept this idea that our consciousness does not terminate at death and that we have a lot of kind of time and space in our hands. But also, we should be very careful with thinking that we have a lot of time, in that our next lifetime might be very different from the comfortable existence that we have right now. So we do what we want with it. But eventually, through working with this working hypothesis, we might be able to replicate the results that the Buddha received. But on the more foundational level, we can, to ourselves, prove his working hypothesis to a certain degree by working with the more surface levels of sukha and dukkha. If we're not yet ready to go into the depths of fully eradicating dukkha and establishing the most incredible bliss that's possible, we can work on the more foundational level to see whether it's possible to become a bit less stressed and anxious and depressed and so forth, and a little more happy. That's kind of foundational level of working with sukha and dukkha, which everyone is welcome to explore. That's the reason for why Buddhism is generally very open towards modern science, using aspects of Buddhist practices for creating different therapeutic modalities. And there are many that are derivatives that were created as derivative forms of practices that were originally established by the Buddha. So we have methods pertaining to the third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. You have such approaches as DBT, ACT, and many others. All of those include aspects of Buddhist practices in a sort of stripped down, simplified way that would hopefully be helpful to people. All of that under this very general working hypothesis of sukha can be strengthened, dukkha can be gradually removed or weakened. And to once again establish this idea that there is inner space of sukha and then the outer space where stuff happens on the outer level, we sometimes talk about this distinction between two types of happiness. So the Greeks actually, around the same time as the Buddha, arrived at a very similar classification where they were talking about hedonic and eudaimonic. Hedonic meaning related to outer stimulation and the bliss that it can bring about, and eudaimonic as it relates to the inner well-being that stems from within. In the Buddhist terminology that is still used to this day, the hedonic happiness is referred to as worldly happiness, jikten ki dewa, which literally means happiness of the basis of destruction. Buddhists in general call the world jikten, which literally means 10, basis of destruction, jik. So what it means is that our world is a very transitory thing. Things are constantly changing. Even our planet is not going to exist forever. Our sun is not going to exist forever, and even though the material universe would probably outlive our planet and our sun, from a Buddhist point of view, even the material universe will eventually collapse back into sort of a state of potentiality, while other universes will continue to exist. And then those universes will dissolve and our universe will re-establish itself. So Buddhists do believe in these multiple world systems or multiple universes that are kind of all in different phases at the same time, but that they're all, by their nature, tend to collapse eventually. So that's the nature of the material world. So that's why it's called happiness related to the basis of destruction. And on a more foundational level, never mind these universes and what happens to them, the Big Bang and then the big flop or whatever it's called. Never mind all that. In our personal life, we might be in the most wonderful relationship right now. Well, one of us will eventually die, or we will leave each other, or something else might happen, and we might have a great job. Well, that's going to go, and our body is healthy now. Well, that's not for long, like all of those sorts of things, which are common sense in a way. Things change, and eventually impermanence catches up with all of us. So it's actually this principle of impermanence that inspired, or it keeps inspiring Buddhist practitioners to look for more viable alternatives to this temporary happiness. Why? Because everything related to this wordless stimulation will eventually leave us. So this cup of coffee that I have right now might be the most divine and delicious cup ever, but it will run out. And even if it didn't, if I had an unlimited supply of espresso in my kitchen, which I almost do, to be fair, with each new cup, I would be experiencing less and less and less pleasure. And eventually it will turn into torture quite quickly. And if it's caffeinated, it will also give me a heart attack. So not very reliable in terms of the amount of happiness that I can squeeze out of this thing that's stimulating me. So there's also that that problem. It's impermanent in terms of it will cease to exist, but it's also impermanent in terms of the bliss that it can bring about. After 3 pieces of cake, it's no longer pleasant. Probably after 1 for some people, or after a few spoonfuls. After a few cups of coffee, it turns into torture. And that goes for every type of external stimulation. So not fully reliable, even though Buddhism doesn't say that there's anything wrong with just having those small pleasures on their own. Buddhism doesn't say that coffee is bad or money is bad or any of those things. In fact, there's a very famous quote related to it from one of the great yogis of the past, Tilopa, who said, "It's not the appearances, meaning these objects themselves, that bind you. It's your grasping at them." So it's no problem with coffee or candy or burgers or whatever, or money, or sex, anything like that, our own good looks or the good looks of others. The problem is trying too hard to grasp at this stuff and squeeze the ultimate sukha out of it. We kind of know that squeezing certain things can produce oil. And we know, oh, well, people squeeze oil out of these sunflower seeds and all this other stuff. Well, I have some sand. Let me try, squeezing it and see if any oil comes out. The problem is Nothing's going to come out because sand does not include oil. So, in a similar nature, I say it's useless trying to squeeze these worldly things and get lasting happiness out of them. In particular, when talking about this worldly happiness, and Lojong teachings do go into great depth with regards to all of this. So, you will see it when we read our first Lojong text next time. In particular, we should be very careful with our attempts to squeeze genuine happiness out of the so-called eight worldly concerns, or eight worldly dharmas, or eight worldly preoccupations, we could say. They are related to these four things listed here on the slide: gain, sensory pleasure, praise, and reputation. These are the main or the most important objects of our worldly grasping, our hedonic grasping. So gain is just owning something, and that includes our money. And for some people, that includes, billions of dollars, or billions upon billions of dollars. But it can also include grasping at a thermos, or a cup, or I don't know, a nice mala, a nice rosary that we're using for practice. Even those things can become objects of grasping. Then sensory pleasure is that refers to the pleasant experiences that we are undergoing with the help of our sensory doors, our eyes, our ears, our tactile sensations, our taste, our sense of taste, and our sense of smell. So some people are quite great, quite good, quite adept at squeezing things out of the sensory pleasures. So some people are very, very familiar with the good types of wine and what wine is good and what wine is not good, or cheese, and all those sorts of things. Music. It can be something very refined according to the worldly conventions, and it can be something very basic. Doesn't matter. It's all sensory stimulation. So whether we are a great fan of Mozart or a great fan of Taylor Swift, doesn't matter in terms of what the category is. It's still sensory stimulation. And then praise is when we hear pleasant words from people to our face, or online, or in any other way. We get a pleasant email that says, "Oh, you're great, you're the best yoga teacher ever," or we get a comment saying something of that nature, or a loved one say it to our face. That's pleasant. And so we can become quite addicted to it, to the point where the number of likes that we get on, let's say, a social media website really affects our sense of self-worth, and becomes sort of an object of our hedonic chase. We are racing after these things, and we're trying to do everything that's in our power to squeeze more happiness out of it. That's also not very sustainable long term. And it would have a negative effect on our general sense of happiness and well-being. And then the final one is reputation. That one is said to be the most pervasive and the most profound, the most difficult one to get rid of. What it refers to is what other people think of us, according to our understanding. Praise is what we actually hear or read, and reputation is just knowing, oh, these people respect me, probably. Or on the opposite side, oh, they don't respect me. So for all four of those, there's a affirmative side and a negative side. That's how you arrive at eight worldly concerns. Liking these things and chasing after them is the first four worldly concerns, and trying to avoid their opposites is the second set of four. So looking for objects that we can possess and trying to avoid loss, looking for pleasant experiences, sensory experiences, trying to avoid unpleasant sensory experiences, looking for praise, trying to avoid blame or unpleasant words, and finally, hoping that others perceive us in a positive light and wanting to avoid bad reputation. That's kind of the last pair. So that's how you have these eight worldly concerns. And the interesting psychological idea here is that unless we know about this other type of happiness, lasting happiness, eudaimonic happiness, that's the one that's on the right side of the slide, we are completely preoccupied by these eight. And not only so, we live in a society, regardless of which society on the planet we live on, to be fair, because Tibet was one of the last great contemplative civilizations, and that was destroyed. So we only have it now in exile and like small clusters, but the civilization itself was destroyed and is being actively destroyed. So with that gone, we all live in societies, regardless of which country we are in, that program us to look for happiness in these eight things. So they say, well, happiness is maybe owning a car, or happiness is having a great reputation in your professional field, or happiness is finding a husband or wife who would be saying pleasant words to you every morning, or happiness is having lots of cheese and wine in the south of France. So basically, these are the main ideas that we're being offered in different configurations and different combinations. And that's all hedonic happiness. No problem with it on its own. The problem arises where that's the only object of our focus. So to discern these impulses within ourselves is actually a part of Lojong training, to look into our mind and to see, oh, what am I being motivated by right now in this moment? Am I being motivated by the wish to squeeze happiness out of these grains of sand, knowing that when I step away from this impulse, I know that I will not receive ultimate happiness from my grasping at reputation or praise or wine or cheese or whatever it might be. The people who possess the most on this planet are not infinitely more happy than anyone else. In fact, some of them probably are more miserable than the people who have almost nothing. So very interesting to look at our own mind in that regard, and the minds or kind of the culture around it and the world in general. And then to look at this other side of the equation, which is what Lojong teachings are all about. They exist to help us in the cultivation of the so-called lasting happiness or genuine happiness. That's the term that Buddhists use sometimes. Yang dakpe dewa, genuine, and yang dakpe dewa, happiness or sukha, or samyak sukha, sat sukha. These are the Sanskrit terms for it. Brought about by inner qualities, by the stable configurations of our mental energy, and by being in touch with our true potential or our true nature, the ground of our being, the deepest levels of our consciousness or awareness. So that's in the Buddha's working hypothesis that was then built on by the great masters of the universities that I mentioned, Nalanda and Vikramashila, and by the great traveling tantric practitioners of ancient India. That's where genuine happiness comes from organizing the energy of our mind in a very special way, primarily where our mental energy revolves around the two key qualities of wisdom and compassion, or wisdom and kindness. And everything else is structured, is built in a way that supports wisdom and kindness. So when we organize our mental energy in this manner, it's basically the idea is that this inner configuration, this inner mechanism that we build, this inner machine that we build, then becomes the happiness producing machine. Instead of generating electricity, it generates sukha, the more profound type of sukha, the genuine type of sukha that cannot be shaken or negatively affected by anything that's happening to us on the outer level. And in a way, from a historical point of view, the ultimate test for this working hypothesis for Tibetans was the occupation and the subsequent genocide, cultural and ethnic, that they experienced. So what happened to the people who were practicing Lojong when those events unfolded? And what's happening now is these events are still unfolding to this day. Almost every day something's happening in that regard, in kind of the field of the news coming from the Himalayan region. But what happened to them? So I have two teachers, both of whom experienced more than 20 years of concentration camp each. So one of them was in a concentration camp for about 20 years, undergoing things like torture and so forth. And another one had the same, basically, experience. Both of them eventually became some of the most highly respected Buddhist masters in the world in general, because they were eventually able to leave Tibet, escape, leave the concentration camp. They were released eventually, and they were able to leave Tibet and teach elsewhere. One of them is still alive. He is based in Arizona, and the other one passed away a few years ago. He was mainly staying in Sikkim in northern India. But what happened to them psychologically? That's the outer side, right? They left Tibet, blah, blah, blah. But what happened to them psychologically? Well, they were some of the most incredibly compassionate, kind lighthearted, joyful people that I've ever met in my life. And that's not just me saying that, that's the experience of many, many other people, including those who are not at all interested in Buddhism itself or Buddhist meditation. It's just the quality of a being that's in front of you. How do you see them? Are they lighthearted? Are they full of humor? Is there sparkling joy inside of them? Are they full of compassion? Does it seem like they're free from PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, that was the case with these two teachers. They had no signs of PTSD despite 20 years of torture and concentration camp. They were full of joy, full of compassion. And in fact, both of them privately mentioned on different occasions that being in concentration camp, despite all the outer difficulties that are unimaginable, in terms of their own mind, was the best kind of retreat. That's the description that they give, the best kind of retreat. For us, the best, even when we are in relatively good retreat conditions, staying for 10 days in a solitary retreat in a five-star hotel, even that sometimes is kind of torture because everything is itchy and scratchy and your mind is extremely, annoyed by everything. And meditation is difficult and this and that and the other thing. It's just a lot of complaints. Even though we might receive some benefit from our retreats, we always have kind of a certain degree of dukkha present in them because we're beginners, maybe. At least I am. But for these beings, being in the worst possible conditions on the planet, where you're quite actively tortured on a regular basis, and physically, and they're trying to also torture you mentally and destroy your spirit and all of those sorts of things. Despite all of that, they said that was the best kind of retreat, and they emerged with a deeper level of practice, with a deeper level of lasting happiness. So that was very unfortunate for them, and totally, it's a wonderful idea to pray that this never happens to anyone on the planet, to make powerful aspirations in that regard. There are many Buddhist prayers for peace and for prosperity and for abundance and for there to be no pandemics and so forth. It's a very important practice that makes our own mind more refined and noble. But it happened to them, that's a fact, and it actually deepened their practice and deepened their experience of happiness. Not because of the outer format of it, but because their practice of Lojong in particular was so strong that they were able to digest all of this suffering and to turn it into happiness. And that's kind of what Lojong teachings are all about. So that's a perfect illustration of how inner sukha can become so vast and so expansive when we invest time and effort into it, that even outer dukkha that's quite strong is fully digested and transformed. And here's a practical question for us then with regards to these two types of happiness that we can invest our time and energy into. How much time did I today, yesterday, this week, this month, this year invest into inner happiness or genuine happiness or happiness of being, this eudaimonic thing, the one on the right? And how much of my time, not just even my spare time, but my time in general, did I invest into hedonic happiness, the one that comes from outer stimulation? Or in more simple terms, how much time did I invest into gain, sensory pleasure, praise, and reputation? How much time did I invest into coming into contact with my own true nature and into organizing my mental energy in a way that brings about sustainable happiness? So, very practical question. And I do have Dharma friends or friends, practitioner friends who, at the end of the day, sometimes journal on this. They just review their day and they think, well, how much time did I spend practicing this eudaimonic stuff? Was it even 15 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour? Ideally, eventually, some teachers, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, say, ideally, eventually, we would have at least 50-50 in terms of how we invest our attention. But initially, to even have 10 to 90, 10% on eudaimonic well-being and 90% still dealing with hedonia and earning your living and so forth, even that's good because initially, when we haven't even heard about this other type of happiness, what we do is 100% goes to hedonia, 0% goes to eudaimonic well-being. And on occasion, we kind of catch a glimpse of this idea of eudaimonia because we know, well, yes, there's this thing called religion, and religions are about some spiritual well-being, but how exactly does it work and how to bring it about? Who knows? So occasionally there is a little glimpse here and there, but mostly we're not very good at investing it in equal manner. So something to consider that is in itself already a practice of Lojong, assessing the current state of our mind and our priorities. So then, the path that leads to the cultivation of this sustainable happiness in Buddhism, and actually that's universal across the four traditions that I mentioned, is known as the Dharma. So the Dharma is a very, very loaded word in Sanskrit. It's for that reason that it's fairly impossible to translate. In early translations from Sanskrit, you would have attempts to translate it as the law or truth or the teaching. But eventually, most people gave up on that because Dharma has at least 10 primary meanings in Sanskrit, and sometimes you need 3 or 4 of them at the same time. So to try to squeeze it all into one English word is kind of useless. So Dharma can mean phenomenon. It can mean yes, indeed, a law or one's moral obligation. And there are many, many other aspects of it. But when we capitalize the term, and in English, when we say Dharma with a capital D, what it refers to is a system of practice that leads us to eudaimonic well-being. And here's a quote from Geshe Namang Dargye, who was a very renowned teacher of the 20th century, one of the first Tibetans in exile to start actively teaching Buddhist philosophy and practice. And he was one of the founders of the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala, which is now one of the major learning centers in northern India for Westerners who come to India interested in the Dharma, want to study it in a systematic and thorough manner while being physically close to the Dalai Lama. So Geshe Namang Dargye was one of the founders of that, and he educated the first major generation of Buddhist translators, amongst other things. So he said, Dharma is a way of viewing reality, a way of engaging with reality that brings a lasting and meaningful sense of well-being. So that's this eudaimonic happiness that Lojong teachings is all about. Lojong teachings themselves are a subgenre of Dharma. But to know what Lojong is, we need to say that Lojong is part of the Dharma, of the Buddhist Dharma in particular. But there are many other Dharmas. There is the Dharma of Sufism. There are many Dharmas within the Hindu tradition. There is even, as some of my teachers say, the Dharma of secular humanism. There are probably different dharmas embedded in the environmentalist movement. All of these are systems that help us develop a deeper sense of well-being, deeper when compared to just hedonic stimulation. And one of the more literal ways of translating the Dharma is to say that it's something that keeps us away from suffering. Because Dharma, the word Dharma, comes from the Rudra, Sanskrit Rudra, which means to hold or to keep something. All the 10 primary meanings of Dharma come from this idea of to hold. So when it's capital D Dharma, let's say the Buddha Dharma or the Hindu Dharma and so forth, these are the Dharmas of Buddhism and Hinduism and so forth that keep us away from suffering. That's the literal etymology of it. Lojong, the teachings that we will be reading, is a system of practices within the Dharma. Just like all the other dharmic stuff, they are meant to keep us away from suffering. But the way they offer to do that is very peculiar or kind of very special when compared to some other dharmic material. Sometimes we say that the Buddha himself taught 84,000 types of teachings. It's kind of an exaggerated number in a way, but actually it's also not completely unrealistic in that if you take all the different practices that the Buddha taught and all the different variations of methods that the Buddha taught, and you try combining them in different ways, you would arrive at a number greater than 84,000. And the reason for that extreme wealth of methods was that we're all different. We have different propensities, we have different talents, interests, and so forth, and also different mental problems. The root of it is the same for all of us, but the unique combinations of mental distortions, there are many of those, and so we all need different combinations of recipes. Same as in cooking, we all have different culinary tastes, we have different tastes in meditation as well. But the Dharma is extremely vast in that regard. And regardless of which combination of methods we use, here's the way that Buddhism suggests for arriving at genuine well being. A state of genuine well being, a state of lasting happiness, is available to us if we attune our mind to the nature of reality. If we learn to see reality as it truly is. Inasmuch, or as long as we're not in tune with reality, as long as we're seeing things in a wrong manner, as long as we're seeing our own self in a wrong way, as long as we're seeing our mind and its nature in a wrong manner, and as long as we misinterpret reality that's kind of external, quote unquote, external to us, we will be suffering. So, for the Buddha, the way to arrive at genuine happiness is to fully attune our mind to reality and to see reality accurately. As long as there's distortions in our seeing of reality, there will be suffering. So it says here, to the degree that we are out of touch with the true nature of reality, we will continue to suffer. So all of the different types of mental gymnastics, and that's a positive term here in Buddhism. So all the different types of mental training, mental weightlifting, all of those sorts of things, they are meant to bring us closer and closer and closer and closer to the nature of reality. So in some systems of Buddhist practice, you would have extremely elaborate explanations of how, by moving through these many, many, many different steps, we would eventually arrive at the true seeing, at seeing the nature correctly and precisely. But it will take us a very long time, and we do need to see all these different types of distortions and gradually, sort of as if removing layers from an onion, slowly, slowly, we will gradually move towards that true seeing. So another way of putting it is to say our mental states directly affect our experience, making us happy or miserable. So we need to work with the mental states that are more realistic, strengthening them. We need to work with the mental states that are not realistic, non-realistic, removing them. And eventually, kind of the degree of realism in our seeing will increase, the degree of unrealistic seeing will decrease. And with each step, we will be becoming happier and happier and happier. So, for those two masters who were in concentration camps and were able to digest that and turn it into genuine happiness, were they, from a Buddhist point of view, fully enlightened? It's very hard to make that statement. They themselves would never claim that, because in Buddhism, if someone from their own side, generally in this day and age, says that they're enlightened, it's a real reason to run away. As most great masters whose realizations are certified by other great masters themselves say that they have nothing special about them, they have no experience, no knowledge, nothing whatsoever, completely empty of any good qualities, blah, 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 blah. They say things like that, and there's good reason for that. That's a principle that was established by the Buddha himself, to never advertise one's spiritual attainments. But let's say another great master looks at those two, and was their ability to fully digest suffering an indication that they've completely removed every vestige of distortions and arrived at a full seeing of reality? Not necessarily. It's a very long journey. It's a very elaborate spectrum. But is it true that they definitely did have genuine experience and genuine realization? Yes, that's quite likely. That's quite likely and quite realistic to say. So that means that we don't only experience happiness when we have fully arrived at full enlightenment, which is a very, very advanced state of completely removing all the negativities and completely perfecting all the positive stuff. No, with each step where something positive grows and something negative falls away, there is a greater degree of subjective happiness that we experience. That's good news for us. And with each step where realistic stuff grows and the bad stuff falls away, we are also becoming a source of better influence for others. We become less harmful and less neurotic and less kind of toxic, you know, and we become more positive, more compassionate, more kind. So the vibe we're giving off is greater, but also the actions of body and speech that we perform towards others are also greater. So that's the good news here once again. If you know, our only chance of arriving at happiness was to wait until full enlightenment, and only then also do we start benefiting others. This course would be pointless because in 6 weeks of where each class is an hour and a half, no, we're not going to arrive at enlightenment, and we barely can grasp the foundational concepts, you know. Uh, Realistically speaking, of course, there's always a chance that someone is very spiritually advanced, but for someone as dull as me, um, I, in 6 weeks, would only be able to kind of get a very basic grasp of the very basic vocabulary. But if that alone can make my mind a tiny bit more compassionate, that means I'm already happier and I'm already a greater source of happiness for others. Why that transformation can occur? Well, here's another foundational Buddhist psychological idea. The main thing in our experience, in our reality, is our own mind. That's what Buddhists very confidently say. It's not our body, even though body is important, of course. That's the thing that gives us a lot of trouble, but also allows us to do lots of stuff. It's not our speech. And Buddhists do identify speech as a separate kind of aspect of our being, which includes our breath and our pranas and all of those sorts of things. But it's not our speech either, with all of its power, which is incredible in terms of benefiting or harming others. It's our mind, the experiencer. And mind in Buddhism as defined as that which is clear and cognizant, or clear and knowing. That's the definition of mind or consciousness or awareness as a fundamental building block of reality. So what is mind when we're trying to see what's the difference between the brain and the mind, for example? And Buddhism very confidently says not the same thing, related to each other, but not the same thing. The mind is the part that is clear in that it's non-material and it can generate holograms. And it's cognizant, meaning that when it generates those holograms, thoughts, images of hot dogs, emotions, and so forth, it knows them in that very moment. As soon as they are generated, the mind knows them. In the process of generating, the mind knows them. So that's the cognizant part. So that's the mind. The brain is a completely different thing. It's a piece of matter with you know, electric and chemical properties and mass and location and space. So they're connected to each other, and that's a very elaborate theme, how exactly and why, but they're not the same phenomenon. So mind is that which is clear and cognizant. And one beautiful thing about the mind is that it's incredibly rich in its flexibility. We can flex it in any number of ways. That's the big discovery also that comes from the Buddhist side, as opposed to kind of the modern sad notions of psychology. Of course, there's now extremely advanced psychology in the West as well, and very optimistic in its nature. And some of the optimism there actually arose out of these wonderful discussions between Buddhism and science. But even a century ago, there were confident claims that we are stuck in our neurotic patterns. And at best, we can attenuate them a tiny bit, but mostly we will always be victims of our base nature, kind of coarse nature, where we're mostly just giant babies obsessed with sex and death. You know, that was the view, and still some people follow that view. And there's not much flexibility there. Well, Buddhism says, no, your awareness is this radiant energy that can be transformed into anything. Not randomly, not immediately, but through training. So just like your body can be trained to become the body of an Olympic athlete, your mind can be trained until it becomes the mind of a fully awakened Buddha, fully blissful at all times. The difference there is that for an Olympic athlete, well, realistically, not everyone can become that. And because there are limitations related to age, there are limitations related to genetics, there's lots of stuff there, right? So the bodies are actually less flexible, but the underlying principle of training is the same. And from a Buddhist point of view, even a person who is very simple can become fully enlightened by receiving the instructions that are appropriate for them. So a person, let's say there were many practitioners in the Tibetan tradition who did not how to read, could not read or write, and yet towards the end of their life, after having spent their entire life as shepherds, or as, let's say, a mother of a family of 17 children, they would receive the instruction that was uniquely catered to them, and they would practice those instructions with full dedication, and then would get fully realized at the end of their life because they had the dedication and they had the right instructions. So that's different from becoming an Olympic athlete. But the underlying principle is the principle of malleability, the fact that we can change mental states and their patterns through working with our awareness. And so the Lojong teachings themselves are specifically, yes, for changing our mental states. And from that point of view, the entirety of Buddhism is Lojong, because the entirety of Buddhism is about changing our mental states. But in particular, Lojong teachings are focused on changing what in English we call our attitude towards something. So in terms of the etymology, the word law can be translated simply as mind, and that's often done. But it also has when it's put into this word Lojong, it has a more specific meaning of attitude or mental state, kind of our view of something, how we approach something. Well, attitude is really the perfect term in that regard. So attitude is the key word here. And jong is a verb that can mean to train. It's included in the term learning, which sounds pretty similar, lobjong. To purify, to refine, to cultivate something. Once again, any word has many different connotations. So there are these. So sometimes because the word train is there, you have the term lojong translated as mind training. And this is where a little bit of confusion arises, because in the West, if you hear the term mind training, you might think, oh, so that's like for developing better memory and stronger IQ, maybe, right? And yeah, you'll be able to put these, whatever they do in those IQ tests, like this triangle goes into this triangle and then they form this thing. It's like cognitive tasks, let's put it that way, computational tasks. Is that what Lojong is about? No, it's not about training in computational skills. It's not about training in math skills or really many of those other intelligences identified by Howard Gardner. They're not at the center of Lojong teachings. They can all be benefited to a certain degree by us strengthening the meta skills, the all-pervasive skills that Lojong is training us in. But the main emphasis is on transforming our attitude into something that's more realistic and more conducive, therefore, to happiness. So therefore, Lojong itself, as it says here, is a system of teachings, in particular transmitted in the Indo-Tibetan lineage, explaining how to transform our mental states, especially our attitudes, including those, and that's a special emphasis in many Lojong texts, including those towards the difficult and pleasant situations that we experience. So in the promo materials for this course, we did refer to a facetious expression I use of attitude bending, coming from the famous TV show by the name of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where if you're not familiar with it, the idea there is, the premise there is that there are certain people in the fantasy world that's depicted there that are born with the ability to bend an element. So there are waterbenders who bend water and airbenders who can control the element of air and so forth. So from a Buddhist point of view, we are all naturally mind benders, and that we can transform, if we learn how to, our mental states. And a subset, or kind of a sub skill of mind bending, is attitude bending, and that's what Lojong is about. It can be actually quite literally translated that way. So law is attitude, and jong can mean to train, to flex, to refine. But why do we flex our attitudes? Not to show off, obviously. It's not that kind of flex, and not to really establish a reputation for ourselves. We're doing it to become a better human being who is therefore more happy and fulfilled. So this is where, before we start reading Lojong text next time, as kind of we're arriving at the conclusion of today, it's good to ask ourselves, well, into what shapes do I want to bend my attitudes? What kind of person do I want to become in terms of the stable configuration of my mind and its energies and its patterns and so forth. So the foundational theory of Lojong is that the point of it is to bend our mind, bend our attitudes into an inseparable union of wisdom and compassion. Because that's the Buddhist working hypothesis of the Mahayana tradition in particular, the great vehicle tradition to which Lojong belongs. Wisdom and compassion are the primary causes of happiness and the primary forces that remove suffering. And so these teachings arrived to Tibet, as I said, through one particular great master that was himself strongly related to the universities of Nalanda and Vikramasila, especially Vikramasila. And that master was Atisha. He was an Indian prince, also just like the Buddha himself, a Bengali prince, though, in this case, who studied Lojong teachings extensively in his time. He even went to Indonesia on a very dangerous and elaborate journey to receive some very important transmissions in Lojong from his teacher, who we now know under the Tibetan name Sir Lingpa, which was probably not his actual name, but we know him as that from the Golden Island of Suvarna Dvipa, probably from Sumatra. So Atisha went to Sumatra to receive those teachings there. He also studied with the great masters of his own time. He received the incredible legacy coming from two other masters, Shantideva and Nagarjuna, who are the absolute kind of pillars of Indian Buddhism, and whose texts themselves contain very important Lojong ideas, Way of the Bodhisattva and Precious Garland. So Atisha received all of this incredible richness, synthesized it. The one we have on the left here is actually Shantideva, who's a very important forefather of Lojong. But Atisha received it all and came to Tibet. And in Tibet, when observing the state of Tibetan Buddhism, and there was Buddhism in Tibet by then for a little while, but there was also a lot of confusion that happened due to some political problems. So Atisha observed all that, and he decided, well, it doesn't seem like Tibetans would really benefit at this stage from studying very elaborate philosophical treatises. What they will benefit from, though, is some quintessential instructions on how to transform their mental states. And so, with that decision, or on the basis of that, he started the genre of Lojong. So many of the most important Lojong teachings or texts were written by Atisha's followers. The people who followed him 1, 2, 3 generations. That's kind of the golden age of Lojong. And the first text that we will start reading next time will be from that era. There are many other Lojong texts. There are still Lojong texts being written right now, and we will read a very modern one as well, written in 2006. But the kind of the earliest ones that were actually called Lojong were written by Atisha's followers on the basis essentially of his oral instructions. You could also say that there are many teachings of the Buddha himself that are in nature Lojong. They're just not called that in terms of the genre. And there are many teachings by Shantideva and Nagarjuna, and eventually it's very good to study all of them. Then the richness of your practice and your knowledge would be incredible. But it's good to start somewhere. So next time we'll start with these foundational texts on wisdom and compassion and attitude bending, written by Atisha's instructions. And this is just a general presentation of the logic and history of it all. As sort of a thing that you can do between this class and the next one, my one suggestion would be to play a little bit with the practice of loving kindness. So I'll just post a link in the chat that you can use if you want. And you're welcome to also use really any loving kindness practice that you want. But this one was just, I recorded it and it's free on Insight Timer. So that's why I'm giving that link. But there are, of course, many, many others. And you can find many others also on my Insight Timer and across the globe. You know, there are billions of loving kindness practices that you can find. And the reason for why I'm suggesting it is that Lojong teachings presuppose that we do have a certain familiarity with loving kindness and compassion. In the past, we did quite a few classes on loving kindness and compassion and the other immeasurables with the Sangye Yoga School. So some of those are also available on YouTube. And but just to listen to a little bit of loving kindness meditation and to train in it a little bit will make it easier next time to look at for us to look at the more advanced stages of loving kindness practices. We will still discuss the definitions and lay down the building blocks as usual, but if you want to listen to loving kindness meditations between now and then, that's a great preparation for those who do want to listen to something. So there's a link in the chat, and if you ever get lost and don't know where to find it, please reach out to me or Kat, Phil. We'll do our best to share something. Yeah, and it's kind of all the time we have today, sadly. And I'm also very apologetic for keeping you late. I mean, I know it's late in the UK, not late for me in Mexico City, but very grateful for your kind attention. And I hope that there was something of benefit. And if not, once again, to quote one of my primary mentors, Chogyam Rinpoche, just eat fruit. You know, there are many ways to be happy. Lojong is just one working hypothesis about how to arrive at genuine happiness. So hopefully there was something of benefit here, and I'll see you all next week, next Wednesday in particular. Thank you so much, and see you all. Bye-bye.